Steeler Fury. SteelerFury.com.
Hello and welcome again to another exciting edition of the Pittsburgh Steelers Show on the SteelerFury.com podcast. I'm your host, Will Massasak, also known as Bradshaw to Ben on the website. Come visit us. And also you might find me as Accidental Zen on Twitter. And I'm joined today by a sort of special guest. I'm going to call it a special guest host of the show. That's from Broncos land and from the land of Twitter draft crazy people. Mr. Gabe Morris is with us. How are you, Gabe?
Hey, doing well, Will. Thank you so much for having me on today. I'd be remiss if I didn't at least start by correcting the Broncos land thing. I'll be crucified if I don't put that into proper context. It's Broncos country for those folks that are out there. Will, you're forgiven. You definitely, you're not in the region any longer, although you did spend some time there. So,
although, I have to say, Gabe, a little bit older than you, in the 70s, there was a famous sign at Three River Stadium. It was one of the oldest, most continuous signs. It's still there today. This is Steelers country, so, before there was all this like America's team and everything else, we were Steelers country. I'm just saying.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of tough. I'll be honest. So I grew up in Colorado, and you get kicked out of the state if you're not a Broncos fan, if you're born and raised there. Yeah. But I will say there was a season during the 70s where my pajamas were Steelers pajamas because that's all you could find anywhere in the the stores at that time. So even in Broncos country, Steelers were a pretty big deal in the 70s.
Yeah, exactly. Right up until Joe Green punched was it Paul Howard in the gut? I think that was the famous moment between the Steelers, and that was the end of the Steelers, domination of the league. The Broncos finally got their number in the playoffs, and Joe Green didn't really like being held. Maybe just being blocked was too much for him as well. And he punched the guard for the Broncos, Paul Howard, in the stomach. You're too young to remember this, but it was quite a moment to see your heroes lose their
evolving.
Head. Yeah, exactly. Well, today is like maybe the culmination of like a lot of work every year for me. And I know you're of the mind, you're into this. You've interviewed me for your blog on this subject before, but this is the reveal of the 2025 what I like to call the B2B, short for Bradshaw to Ben back in the day, B2B Directional State Team. This is my 21st Directional State Team that I'm putting out this year.
Wow.
I have a lot of misses and a lot of alumni and a lot of guys that should have made it and didn't really get a shot. But it also helps to have, if you put like 200 people on your list every year, which not quite that many, but if you put 200 people on the list, some of them are bound to work out for you. But at any rate, this is my list of some of the best undervalued and small school players that are available this year in the draft. And I don't know. It's every year it feels like there's a crop and some special guys, and I love finding out about them. I love talking about them. I love hoarding them before draft a team, as you know from the last couple of years that I'm
absolutely
very secretive about. Some of the guys that I like until they're either drafted or I get them or whatever. So, Gabe, this is your moment to finally pick my brain and get my honest opinion about and no disinformation about guys that I like. I figured you're the perfect guy, having done shows with you about day 3 prospects and small schoolers on the Draft Professor Network and other places. So anyway, Gabe, what's your take? Where would you like to start?
Well, first, let me say, so if this is new to you, if this is the first time you're watching this or the first time you've heard of Will's big board, nobody does this like Will does this, and there's really nobody that I know of who does a better job of shining the spotlight on some small school prospects, and not just small school prospects, but also, there are several we'll talk about today who started off in smaller or lesser known schools, some very, very small schools. Some of them, you might know if you're like me and had a kid who went to that school, but otherwise would have no idea otherwise. No, but I would say you're in for a treat when the article is released into the wild. He's being humble in saying that not quite 200 prospects, but it's pretty close. So I'll say, yeah, there's a lot of meat on that bone, and I'm looking forward to chopping it up today. Some of what we go through, most of what we start with will be some that Will has spent a significant amount of time on. I'll be completely honest and let you know, I don't do nearly the amount of work on the smaller school prospects as Will does. And so some of these folks he's introduced to me, and I've been, really excited to see some of them. But then I'll talk through a few that maybe didn't quite make the cut on his list that are folks that I've paid attention to. Draft a team, as he mentioned. You can find that content, by the way, if you're interested in seeing a little bit about Draft a Team and what that looks like. I put some things out on my Twitter, and you can see that in my title there.
We had 21 GMs select an entire team of offense and defense just from this year's draft. So that means like 540 some prospects we picked. So yeah, it's like you have to get beyond your comfort zone, and you have to dig a little bit and find out about prospects you otherwise wouldn't. So by the time Draft a Team is done, you got a pretty good handle on the guys that are going to be the undrafted free agents and the values late in the draft, and maybe even guys you'll see in the UFL or CFL someday.
Yeah, and you might have lost a few friends in the process. It gets a little bit like the Hunger Games toward the end of the whole thing, but it is absolutely my favorite draft event every year, and so I've been grateful to have been included in that recently.
You've been very welcome. Well, I'd just like to say, the reason I started this angle about the undervalued and small school players is that, I was involved in very early days of people doing, human being mock drafts rather than, a simulator or just guessing who might be available at a certain time. You have to actually, strategize against other people who are picking for their teams. I think I did the first one of those maybe 25 years ago or perhaps more. So that's in the days like before the internet was really happening, this kind of thing, and certainly before stuff like Twitter. So it was a very laborious prospect. It took, I think, 2 months or something almost to get through one. Feel like you almost had to send a letter in the mail to get it done.
Word processor.
But I realized there were a few guys, almost everybody, the old timers in there were all these old draft heads, like the kind of people that, viewed Mel Kiper as being a newcomer that didn't know what he was talking about, like that kind of draft head back in the day. And so they ruled with knowing, they knew everything there was to know about the top prospects. And so I didn't have much of an inroads to like compete with them in that regard for knowledge. But so I thought, well, I'm going to go after some people, try to find value buys, because to me, I feel like especially day 3 in the draft is all about value. I feel like you get to round 4, if you can select somebody that is worth more than a 4th round pick, then you've succeeded. You've won the draft. And I know that Pat and the GM with Denver is very much of that mindset, and that I feel like the teams that are take day 4 seriously, they have a lot of success with it. You get some guys out of that section of the draft, and there's some we can all name all-time greats who were day 4 picks or undrafted free agents, including a couple for each of our teams that are in the Hall of Fame, and guys like Tom Brady, Antonio Brown. So every year there's a few guys, and it definitely helps to. I feel like I pretend to be that much of an expert. I just like what I like. I've come up with certain ways of identifying players, and it usually works out okay. I'm rarely embarrassed about the guys I pick, but anyway, maybe we'll talk about the this year's. I always select somebody as the player of the year. I've really got a handful that could have been my prospect of the year when it comes to undervalued and small schools, but I like, when it's a tie, I like the tie to go to the smaller school. So from that standpoint, my player of the year this year for the Directional State Team is Lan Larison of California Davis. If probably you get this is somebody that, like, at this stage of the draft process with like a week or 2 to go, suddenly everybody discovers prospects like this. They see that, oh, somebody had a really good pro day. Oh, that guy scored 1 billion touchdowns. I think he had something like 20 touchdowns or something combined this year. So, he's someone that was absolutely the focal point of an FCS team. And, guys like that usually hold up well when they come up a level, because they're used to every defender is paying attention for them. Every defense is keyed on him, and he still managed to make, not only a lot of big plays, but also, very consistently, could convert a 3rd down or 4th down when you really needed to play. So he's always the guy they targeted when you need to play, even though everyone knows he's getting it. In addition to that, is a four-way special teamer. He was a gunner on special teams, and actually quite a good gunner. And as I like to say in the article, he is the guy when you're on onside kick receiving team. He's the guy that you want to get the ball. Like everything is set up so that that ball's going to go to him, and he's gonna grab it. Had very few drops and fumbles in his college career. I think even with all that heavy workload, I think he had 3 total. So, and you can see if you look at his tape. I don't know. Have you seen the highlight reel that I shared?
I did. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a crazy good cut up. I mean, cut ups are always like, okay, maybe you're missing something about weaknesses that the player has or whatever, but just focusing on the strengths. There's a couple of really strange things about it. One is, well, not strange, but good things. He's capable of catching on the dead run balls that are off target and not losing stride, which I think is a huge thing in the NFL. You can't catch and gather the ball. You have to just take it as part of what you're normally doing and just keep going. That separates, running backs. And even some running backs in the draft who are considered to be elite prospects are not that good at that skill. They're great runners and they have good vision. Maybe they're fast and good athletes, but the catch and gather part of it limits them as receivers, but that's not a problem for him. But the main thing I noticed with him is contact balance. In particular, he can be running full speed up the sideline. Gabe, you played sports. You're running up a line. You just naturally want to fall out of bounds. Like, the natural tendency is to worry so much about going straight that you have trouble keeping your balance when you do that, right?
Yeah.
He not only can run full speed up the line, but guys hit him. Somebody pushes him towards the sideline. Another guy hits him, spins, whatever happens. He never actually loses his line or really loses any speed or momentum going down the line. I'm not sure I've ever seen a running back prospect that was that immune to contact. So maybe it goes back to his former career or his sideline, which is being a champion steer rustler, right? In the rodeo. So I don't know, like, you're from Colorado. You've probably seen some wrestlers in your time.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, I think, core strength for sure would play a part in that. There's no doubt. And, I think if you get a guy, even from a school like Boise State, right, you get a guy like Ashton Genty, the blue field alone will draw quite a few, views every single season. So, that spotlight, while it's not the same as maybe it would be at a large program like Ohio State, is still enough to draw the attention of the NFL world and the rest of the collegiate world. But you get a guy who's playing at Cal Davis, that's a different level of interest right there. And for sure, scouts, at least I can say, as you mentioned, I'm proud to say the Broncos scouts don't shy away from small schools. In fact, you very often see their names on these lists of scout visits to some of these smaller schools or pro days that include smaller school prospects. Mm-hmm. But it's still, as you said, it's interesting as you get closer and it starts to feel like everybody's eyeballing your favorite players and you're starting to look for plan B and plan C and plan D. These folks tend to pop out and they come up and, some not often drafted. Sometimes they end up as a UDFA kind of priority free agent, but still they start to, spring up around this time. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm, with a player like this coming from the FCS, it all depends on what kind of shot you get, like, I think he's a Christian McCaffrey type player. Mm-hmm. So I would, if he goes to a team that sort of organizes the way its offense works in that direction, as opposed to somebody, let's say, that's looking for a power running back. Yeah. But if it's somebody that, you're looking for a guy that can block a little bit and can catch the ball out of the backfield and can run for you, especially run on downs that teams aren't always expecting runs. I feel like he's a really good option for somebody. So I hope that he gets a shot. The opportunity for guys like this, like, you don't get a lot of chances to fail, so you got to have something that's a reasonable fit to get started. But I think you'll see him. I think you'll see him be drafted, and as opposed to an undrafted free agent, which will help his cause a little bit.
Absolutely, yeah. If you got a little skin in the game, it makes it a little easier to stick with one of those guys.
Absolutely.
Yeah. As I remembered, the top of the list, I think you had Esapole up at the top of the list, if I'm not mistaken. There.
Yeah, he's
one. from Washington State. He's one who's interesting to me because of his backstory, and you mentioned that, you bring that out in your article, talk a little bit about how he ended up playing football, which was it was a very abnormal path,
Yeah,
playing
absolutely.
football. But he's a mountain of a man, and had he grown up in an environment that permitted football, he'd be a lot farther along in his development. And I can tell you now, just the reason that he sticks out to me is, of course, I come at this from a Broncos angle. I love the NFL draft and I love all the things about it, but from a Denver Broncos angle, he very much fits the prototype of what Sean Payton likes in a tackle. He likes gargantuan human beings on the ends, and then they there's this sort of U shape to a Sean Payton line where it starts with behemoths on the edges and they get to be progressively shorter. And a lot of that had to do with Drew Brees sitting behind center and whether or not he could see through that window. But that's kind of where he's grown comfortable. So when I see that guy, immediately I can see him in orange and blue. The Broncos signed a free agent, undrafted free agent last year, in a prospect out of Wyoming, who similar sort of build, but not nearly so powerful. And so I thought it's interesting to me that you have a guy that big who can move that well, and that he has that low mileage on his body in terms of actual football mileage. I think that's a rare combination.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the latecomer thing. It makes you really feels promising for the future because, 4 years ago he hadn't even done weight training really, and never played, started a game at offensive line, and then even in 2023 he was not really very good. I mean, he's big, and so whenever he was able to win just by outmassing the person across from him, he did pretty well. But when he faced a skilled pass rusher like Letu from UCLA, I mean, that might have been one of the most dominant performances you'll ever see an edge rusher have in a single game. But I feel like this progression from 2023 to 2024, even, he suddenly like blossomed into a player that not only learned from the hard lessons of kind of take the jump up in competition for somebody that doesn't have that much experience, but he's got the size and length. He looks like an NFL offensive tackle, and he certainly performed like one this year.
First off the bus, I watched a little bit of an interview with him. One thing that was impressive to me is, he suffered through what he did not go so far as to say it was poor coaching, when he played prior to Washington State, but he suffered through some mediocre coaching, we'll just say, to be kind about it. Yeah. And he simply said what we all know to be true, which is you do bad things over and over again, you develop bad habits. Sure. When you do good things over and over again, you develop good habits. Well, people weren't really calling him out on the bad habits, so he was trying to survive just based on what he knew to be his tools, which are he's got mass, he's got length. But you get a guy like Latu who has more in his tool bag than he had. Size just doesn't cut it anymore. And coming to this next level, I think it's been great for him to get some strong coaching. So
yeah, I don't feel like it's going to be the same kind of curve when he comes. He's definitely a developmental type guy, but it would not be impossible for him to slot in at guard someplace and then learn his way into the NFL game and see what it can be about. But like that, even just the strength training is going to be it was a jump from from doing nothing to JUCO, and then from JUCO to Washington State. And no matter where he goes in the NFL, it's going to be a big jump with that as well. So I think it's going to take a little time, but that's it. It also did with Jordan Mailata. So it's like, if you're built like that and you have the movement skills, NFL teams, that's one of the few positions that NFL teams will spend some time developing a player, right? They won't spend a lot of time developing a quarterback, not going to spend any time developing a running back, but for somebody that's a Planet Theory size guy like that, they might. So,
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, like, so the fact that you're focused on interviews is kind of fun, Gabe, because that is like since you said that to me a couple of months ago, I have gotten down that road a little bit. But it is a rather, I mean, I realized I was doing it a little bit, especially when, I didn't know that much about a player, like what will I like having them in my locker room, you know? So it certainly helps to get a little insight into them. But this, you know, someone like this who has a wild story, like they has to have some sort of passion for the game to get this far in such a short time. I feel like especially in that case, then you want to see like, how does this guy tick? Because you're going to have to work. You know, everybody has to work at the NFL, even the really talented athletes, but especially somebody who's a little bit, you know, starting from a position that's a little bit behind.
Well, and you know, not to go too far down this rabbit trail, but what I will say is, you know, you look at a guy recently, we went through draft a team, and you look at a guy like Isaiah Bond, and Isaiah Bond has physical tools like you wouldn't believe. But when I watched his interview, even before, and I'd seen his tape, and that wasn't, to me, it wasn't spectacular in the first place, but he has athletic skill like few others in the draft. However, when I watched his interview, there were flags in the interview that I'm an HR guy. So my background, I mean, I'm a military guy who came into human resources. My background is in interviewing people. And so when I hear flags that are me first things, and you know, that are issues that you could see as potential football character issues, well, then you see him come out into real life. It was only 2 weeks later, suddenly we're dealing with an actual real world issue with that player. And it's, you know, the indicators are there. So yeah, the interviews are a huge part for me.
Although, you know, wide receivers are a different breed.
Yes, that's true. A little like fighter pilots in the sense that some ego is sort of a prerequisite.
Yeah, exactly. They corners and wide receivers definitely have to have like a little thing that, you know, it doesn't matter what what happened 5 minutes ago, like the goldfish mentality about everything.
Yeah.
But I think that especially about themselves, you know.
Very true.
But you know, it's a razor's edge. If they go too far off the edge, then it's like they really, you know, become Antonio Brown or whatever.
Yes.
So you never know.
Tearing their shirts off on the sidelines and such.
Were you familiar with Mitch Van Vooren from St. Norbert?
No, that was actually a new name to me.
Yeah, so Mitch Van Vooren was an all conference. I might even been a champion actually in the 400 meters in the Big Ten, from running for Marquette. So he was a bit of a track star there, a scholarship guy, and then at some point towards the end of his track career, he realized that he had sort of like an unfulfilled dream of football. He hadn't really played football since the 8th grade, but I think he didn't really think he had a future in on the track. So he decided to try to give it a shot. And from his standpoint, he took an opportunity to start from scratch and maybe see how it goes, because maybe you don't know. I haven't really played football since the 8th grade. How am I going to do? I'm a good athlete, obviously, but it was very strange. He went to St. Norbert, which is a D3 school just outside Chicago, not far from Marquette. And at first, it was sort of like they worked him in a little bit the first couple of games, but by the 3rd game, they started not only starting him but feeding him the football, and they reeled off 8 straight wins, which I think is a lot of wins for St. Norbert compared to where they normally are at. And you see him, and he's not the most polished looking tight end for route runner. He doesn't exactly look like a basketball player, but he looks like he has that athlete sense of movement and of using his body and getting it into the right places. And yeah, it's a very low level of football compared to where he would go to, but I feel like he's somebody that will earn a shot. And just an interesting story to go from no football. Tight end seems to be that position where you can go from just being a really good athlete in basketball or a rugby or track or something like that, and somehow convert it into just being big, hitting some guys and catching the football. Like it's not quite as complicated, but it seemed to work out for him.
Yeah, you get a Julius Thomas kind of person on occasion, and he strikes some gold. Well, and you mentioned something. You've mentioned it several times since we've known each other, and a lot of this is getting to know these players from obscure schools. It's not just the NFL that we're looking at. We're also looking at the Canadian Football League, where you might see some of these names, and sometimes that's the winding path that you end up with for a prospect, where hey, maybe they go undrafted, but then somebody is interested in them in the CFL, but then they do a couple of years in the CFL and they work their way back in. The Broncos have a starting middle linebacker who went that route, who ended up having Alex Singleton. He had a stellar career with the CFL and then worked his way back into the NFL and then ended up as a starter, but for whatever reason was not really so much on the radar for teams at the at draft time. So I would say that's the value to a lot of this, is just it might be the long game that you're playing where hey, down the road after these players have gone and played in other leagues, there's a hole in a roster on a play on a practice squad, and suddenly this team signs some guy who you've never heard of from Marquette. And then you realize, hey, wait a second, I think I drafted that guy and draft a team a couple
Right.
of years ago.
This is me watching the UFL. It's always like about five of my guys on each side in every one of those games. And the thing I'll say about this, so this path of like to the CFL or the UFL and working your way back to the NFL, the problem as I see it is I think there's remarkably little movement, upward movement from those leagues to the NFL. I think it should be a league where you can see, hey, well, this guy never got a shot in the NFL, but he can play. So let's bring him into camp and see what we can do. And they do get some camp invites and the occasional practice squad invite or whatever. But yeah, like I think it's somehow the NFL still hasn't really let go of its mentality of if you were good enough to be here for training camp, then you wouldn't be in the UFL. And I think that's a mistake. I think they should be taking more advantage of that, especially like in a way, I almost feel like the UFL would work better, or CFL for that matter, would work better if they had affiliations with NFL teams and you could have your third, developmental quarterback or left tackle play in those leagues during the season. Because in a way, the reps would really help someone like that compared to just watching practice and getting 3 reps in practice or something. Because a lot of those cats, if you're a third stringer in the NFL, you don't get a lot of reps.
That's the truth. And I long for the days where we had an NFL Europe, where that was an option where you could take a guy and you just felt, I mean, we got Kurt Warner out of the whole deal. So, I mean, I think that's right there enough proof to show that, and we know there's an appetite for football across the globe. So I think if ever we get back to some sort of a developmental league, the footprint's there. They need to dust it off and pull it back out.
It's not like they don't have the money, Gabe. They could have a minor league in Europe and the UFL, pay for it all with affiliated players that they already had, rights to, and then have them play a championship game at the end of the year. Like there's enough money to be made from it to offset the costs of doing it and the benefit of doing it in terms of developing players and coaches, because also it's developing coaches, right?
100%.
So, and GMs, I guess that, there was a GM that went from like, high school to GMing a team in the USFL, and is now like, running, it's going to be running the front office for somebody in the NFL in a year or two. So it's like, there are definitely, it's provided a pathway for certain things, but it could do more. We want more.
Absolutely.
Well, how about Dylan Brown, the cornerback from Wisconsin River Falls? Is this a player that you had heard about at all?
No, that one was new to me as well.
He had a big pro day, so that sort of made the rounds for a little while. I think he had an RAS score in the 9s or something. So funny, during draft team, our mutual friend Jolene likes to pick the RAS play, the high RAS players, and I was like, she's gonna know this kid. And as it turned out, I didn't, I had too many corners I wanted to pick, and I didn't actually get to him. But I thought, for sure that you guys might be hip to him. So that's D3 again, and it's definitely not the highest level of football, but he tested like an NFL athlete. And you watch him, there's one particular thing about his play. He's very physical, so he's not just like a cover corner, but we always complain that cornerbacks, even good ones and good coverage cornerbacks, don't turn their head when the ball comes, and they miss opportunities to break up the ball, to make interceptions, and they also panic because they know the ball's coming, but they're afraid to like turn and look and lose track of the receiver. But this is a guy that, like, it feels like every highlight is him turning his head to the ball, like sometimes even better than the receiver. Like he looked like he's the intended receiver a lot of times because he's looking for the ball early and making plays on it without worrying about where's the receiver. He's just going for the ball, which I think is a wonderful skill to have in a developmental corner. Got pretty good size. He's one of those sort of, size, weight, athlete type corners anyway. And then you add to that the ball awareness that most cornerbacks don't have. And I feel like, even being D3, he's got a shot.
Yeah.
I mean, there aren't a lot of D3 players in the NFL. There's a handful. D2 defensive backs, as we maybe talked about on the other broadcast. I talked about on the other broadcast on Draft Professors the other day. There's quite a bit. There's, I think, 13 out of approximately 300 defensive backs in the NFL are from D2. So that tracks. That feels like, wow, if you're a really good player at D2 at that position, you have a reasonable shot in the NFL. That's probably as many as come from some of the lesser conferences in the FBS even. So that seems like a lot of guys.
Yeah, this guy was one that you and I discussed in a side chat
That's great.
a long time ago. And you made me promise not to take him. And so I kind of put him on the side burner there. But he came up in conversation as we were discussing Denzel Burke from Ohio State University. And so, really just highlights really the need for the kind of thing that you do from a media coverage standpoint. There's really not a lot of this out there. That this kind of content's not out there. You won't see any unless it's the local college media. You typically don't see a lot of spotlight on these guys. And for the listeners, the people who are watching this, when you highlight somebody like that, and you call them out on X, it's almost like they feel seen finally, and they'll respond to your tweets. They'll retweet them because they kind of become their own agents. They're their own press in a lot of ways. And so I recall this guy now that we're talking through this, because we kind of talked about that turning of the head as it relates to Denzel Burke, and that being something that maybe, even though at one point he was considered to be a round one prospect, he's fallen from that point. But that's one of the detractors that you don't have in this prospect.
Well, and the tackling.
Then there's that.
And then there's the tackling.
Yes, then there's that.
Very good cover corner. I mean, he's draped over guys in the best possible way and plays the pocket. So he's developed, a plan for how to deal with the catch point that's been pretty successful for him. But it's like a certain kind of fit. Some teams don't mind that in a corner that's less physical. That's just cover that guy. So that's your job. And if that's what you're looking for, guys like that will work. I tend to favor, as you can tell, if you look through the history of the cornerbacks and safeties that I have selected for this team over the years, I tend to favor guys who are more physical. I would say mostly because it feels like if you're coming from a lesser program or you're less well known, that you're going to have to make your mark a little bit on special teams and with physicality and tackling, things that are more than just covering somebody. So I feel like if you're trying to find guys that might have a shot to stick or be successful, that's where I always go. I got two more that I want to talk about before, and then maybe I'll open it to you, and you can point out a couple that either aren't on here or guys that are on here that you really like, because I know there are a couple. But just quickly, Charles Grant is somebody that several people know, the offensive lineman from William and Mary. I had a good laugh because for the last 3 months, Charles Grant was, he's going to be a guard in the NFL. He can't stick a tackle or whatever. And then I think as more people saw him and realized, the athleticism that the guy has and his length of 35-inch arms, that there were a lot of misconceptions about his play, but on tape, he's got an argument for being the best left tackle prospect in this draft. So the idea of him being a guard that goes in the third or fourth round, I was like, I don't think so. So annually I have somebody on this list that's like, started with Carl Joseph. It's like a player that people are talking about being, somewhere down day 3 or, pick 80 or whatever, who ends up going much earlier than that. And I feel like Charles Grant is that guy this year.
Yeah. And he is one that I think he's come up over and over and over again in all of our drafts, not just the drafted team, where some of these cats won't see the light of day in a typical seven round mock, where you're,
Right.
even if you are kind of what draft enthusiast might be a little kind when you talk about what we are, but maybe degenerates. When you look at, even with that group, you don't typically see some of these guys show up in a 7-round mock, but Charles Grant's one of those that routinely has popped up. Now, I will say that the people that we tend to draft with, they are higher oftentimes on some of these smaller school prospects because they pay attention.
Right.
Some of them are affiliated with you and running your circle. Some of them are just also equally degenerate. But I would say that, a lot of these folks, even though they have the talent to be drafted on day 3, some of them have the talent probably even to be drafted earlier than that. And we're not talking about Charles Grant in this scenario. He'll be drafted, and he'll be drafted earlier than most think. But a lot of these players are folks who, just because they've never heard of their name and they haven't, they're not, they haven't seen the light of day. They're not going to get drafted. They're going to end up as undrafted free agents.
But I also think there's a sort of a bias towards the All-Star games. Charles Grant was invited to the Senior Bowl, and he was still recovering from an injury from during the season, and so he didn't. He unfortunately had to decline Senior Bowl. But the way Gray Zabel came in from small school, came to the Senior Bowl, basically shut out. It was pitched a shutout for practices in the game. I mean, like, the dude was unbelievable at every position along the line. And guys, the defensive guys were like begging to go against him because everybody wanted to be the first one to beat him. And, so just off of that alone, people realized, oh, well, this guy is not just small school good. He's really good. There's buzz about him going in the first round now, right? And it was not like that at all before the Senior Bowl. I think that was an important proving ground for him. If Charles Grant had gone to the Senior Bowl and been nearly as effective or similarly effective, I think a lot more people would be talking about him, just because he's just prototypically sized. From the Steelers standpoint, he's a player that one of the few offensive linemen that they've actually paid attention to this year and met with. So it's not impossible. The Steelers situation is they don't really have a clearly defined left tackle at this point, and I think they have a left guard who's probably either going to be gone by next year or perhaps even this year if the chips fall the correct way. So they could use a guy with some, tackle guard flexibility. And it's the type of lineman that they like. And also, since, Weidl came over from Philadelphia back to Pittsburgh, he's adopted that mentality of, like, you win with the fat guys. So I feel like you got an athletic guy who is straight out of central casting left tackle possibly for a team that doesn't really have a clear winner at left tackle. So, or at the very least to offer some depth at tackle that they don't have right now. So I could see that. I see that happening. Problem is they don't have a 2nd-round pick, and I don't think Charles Grant makes it to 83. But there's talks of trades and trade downs, and you never know about this kind of thing. So
no, you don't.
And then the other player is probably, arguably, could also have been my player of the year. Like, I try to give a lot of stock to the cats who started off at very small schools and worked their way up to the big time and had success when they got there. And this guy's one of them, Isaac TeSlaa from Arkansas via Hillsdale. Hillsdale's actually had, I think, Gerald Veldheer, the tackle that went to the Raiders, I think he was a 1st-round pick, if I'm not mistaken. So Isaac TeSlaa won't even be the highest pick out in the history of Hillsdale, but they may be the only 2 guys that have ever come from Hillsdale and made it a sniff to the NFL. He at Hillsdale, he was that guy that was like, much like we described Lan Larison earlier, the focal point of the offense, where like every play is going to him and he's making stuff all over the field. And his big skill, aside from the fact that he's big, he's like 6'3" and over 200 pounds. He's a good sized receiver who also runs 4.3 or 4.4, very fast for his size, and has very good athleticism and explosion, like in the 95th to 99th percentile for basically everything. He's very close to a 10 in RAS if you follow that kind of thing. But he's never had a drop in his entire collegiate career. That's pretty hard to believe, considering that he makes quite a lot of acrobatic type catches, or especially when he was at Hillsdale. The quarterback there looked like a jugs machine set on random, like a jugs machine with random objects being put into it. It's like, here's a grapefruit, and here's a football, and here's a bowling ball. And it's like, you have to figure out where it's going. So considering all of that, I feel like he's very underlooked. Everybody, Puka Nacua, by the way, was one of my favorite cats on the directional state team the year that he came out. I'd actually been interested. I think I had his brother, one of his older brothers, as like an honorable mention one year. And so when I saw another Nacua, I was like, who's this guy at BYU? Everybody's always trying to find the next Puka Nacua, a guy that comes in, on day 3 and suddenly lights up the league with the versatility and, being able to play inside, outside and make plays for you. I can't think of a better candidate in this year's draft to be in that Puka Nacua type role and get that kind of output. And in a way, he's maybe not as shifty as Puka is, but he's definitely shifty in terms of on the football field with the ball in his hands.
Right.
He tends to be more of I got the ball, I'm going upfield. But in terms of his ability to run routes and catch the football and get open, very good. To me, that's an excellent comparison.
Yeah, I think that's a great one. When you talk about Arkansas, that naturally my mind goes to another wide receiver.
He's also fantastic, and also came from a small school, by the way.
Yeah. Andrew Armstrong is the most bizarrely unheralded wide receiver I've seen in a long time, and by that I mean he's the SEC's leading wideout in terms of yardage. Now, granted, the SEC has not often fielded a bunch of teams who are really airing it out on a routine basis, but even so, that's something we should take notice of, I think. And frankly, both really, I'm going to lump both of these guys. I'm going to take TeSlaa and I'm going to take Armstrong together and put them into the same problem here, the same problem set. That offense, 34 rushing touchdowns, I think, for that offense in the year, and only 16 receiving touchdowns. Nobody had more than, I think there was one guy with 3 receiving touchdowns. Well, TeSlaa did, but there was another guy, I think 3 or 4, receiving touchdowns. It was a tight end. That's problematic for anybody hoping to make a big name for themselves. But then the other thing is, if you turn Andrew Armstrong's tape on, first of all, he catches everything that's thrown at him. But the other piece of it is, he had the Nathaniel Hackett offense sort of mentality there that coach did clearly, because everything was thrown short of the sticks. And it was, hey, muscle your way forward to get the first down. Armstrong, if depending on what you believe, if you go by his pro day, like we know that the times are always inflated. Pro day numbers, I think it was a 4.37 that they said he ran. And then, if you look at estimates of his time at 4.51, I tend to believe he's somewhere in the probably mid 4.4 ranges if we're being realistic. But he never got an opportunity.
Bear in mind that those numbers from like pro day are just so. Everybody has their own set of numbers. Every team is going to have a different number on the board.
They're absurd.
So you can get this preliminary number and then the official number, and they might both be correct for somebody. So anyway, sorry.
Yeah, that's right. And for me, what really matters, and you and I have had this conversation on the side, is game speed. I would love to get us to a place where we're really more reliant on GPS speed to track these guys in game, find out what they're capable of getting up to. But honestly, Armstrong, TeSlaa had a couple of these on tape where you see he actually hit him over the top and he broke away, and those were his touchdowns. But when it comes to Armstrong, the ball wasn't thrown out in front of him very often. It was almost always thrown somewhere behind the line to gain, and it was on him to figure out how to get that yardage. And he was always the outlet when things got tight. And frankly, while athletically that quarterback is gifted, he threw some stuff, some random stuff out there that Armstrong made him look good with on a regular basis. And so I would just say, hey, if you're looking for a guy to hands catch away from his body and to get you that first down, a third down machine, and I think he can be more. I think he just wasn't given a chance to really do that. He's somebody that I would definitely recommend you pay attention to.
Yeah, I think he's a very similar player to Tory Horton from Colorado State.
Yeah.
Right? They're both hands catchers. They both were featured in an offense that mostly had them do exactly what you said: catch the ball underneath and figure out how to muscle your way to get a first down or run around the defense to get a first down. But then when they were given opportunities to go down the field or make contested catches or routes nearer to the red zone, they would be the guy that would make a play for you, especially the guy you look for. As I said before, I feel like there's a lot of pressure on guys that the team knows they're we're looking for you down here.
Yeah.
So that if you have success doing that, I feel like it's a good harbinger for what goes forward, right?
Yeah.
And I think Tory Horton is.
I agree.
It probably. I'm trying to figure out where exactly he is in the consensus, but if he feels like 2 rounds earlier than Andrew Armstrong in terms of how people perceive them or how they're viewed in the comp board. So I always like this the year that Mike Wallace came out for the Steelers from Mississippi, that I remember it being said on our podcast that people wanted Darius Hayward-Bay because he was super fast, he was a big target and going to be a deep threat. And one of my cohorts on the show said, yeah, but the thing is that Mike Wallace, you get in the 4th round and he's like the same, attributes. So why spend a first round, why try to trade up in the 1st round or spend a mid-1st round pick on somebody when you could get that same thing in the 4th round, So yeah. I feel like that's the thing with Andrew Armstrong is somebody out there is going to get a steal because I think they're both good players. But Tory Horton right now is around 112 and Andrew Armstrong's around 240 in terms of the mock, the database. So that tells me that somebody is going to get a really good deal late on the 3rd day.
I would agree. And I think, obviously if you and I are seeing it, the scouts that go to these games are also paying attention to this, but they're not going to overpay if they don't have to either. So, I think, the thing that you get with Andrew Armstrong that you don't get with Tory Horton. So Tory Horton coming off of an injury, for him to have run a 4.41 at the combine, which I think what I recall he ran, coming off of an injury is pretty good. That shows you that he's on track. But, there's a recency to Andrew Armstrong's game that you can you don't have to try to translate anything. You can see it there, and you don't have to be a genius to figure out that, hey, with a little better ball placement, that guy's gone a few times a game. But most of the time, he didn't get that opportunity. It was either thrown to him, it was an out where it wasn't intended to give him space to run, or it was thrown behind him, or it was thrown, wildly above and outside, just a bit outside. And Bob Euchre. But I think, he's one of my favorites. And that I have been watching wide receivers in that general range for a while because I don't think the Broncos will select somebody that high. If they do, Courtland Sutton's gone. But I've been paying attention to those middle rounds, right, wide receivers, and he just sticks out every time I turn the tape on. So
yeah, same thing. Watching him, it just felt like he was the guy that with the catch radius and make your quarterback look good and whatever. And Taylor Green is like at this stage, last 2024, Taylor Green is definitely like sort of like Lamar Jackson, like in that he can make a lot of plays, but he's more focused on escaping pressure and delivering the ball somewhere in your general vicinity than he is about the specific accuracy. But those things come over time. Even Lamar Jackson got a lot better at that, as you can tell in the NFL. So anyway, I have high hopes for Taylor Green. He's he's one of my favorite quarterbacks in the potentially year's class. So I don't want to leave any bad taste in people's mouth about Taylor Green.
That's a preview. That's a teaser for next year's
team. Yeah, exactly. Do you I know that we're going to get to somebody that you have, or some buddies that you have that aren't on my list, and maybe we'll wrap it up with your daughter's alma mater. But hit me with somebody that I don't have on the list that I should. I probably just should have had, forgot or should have had him on there and missed it.
Yeah, so a guy that really stood out to me, and this was thanks to the draft team. When you get toward the end of that thing, it varies a little bit every year which positions you find yourself scrambling to fill. But one that's pretty consistently left toward the end is safety. And so knowing that was the case, I kind of started in the middle of the draft, just researching the deep safeties.
Because that's what you do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So that's right. So Grand Valley State University, that's not a team that you hear a whole lot about. It's not a football program you hear a bunch about. So Matthew Judon did come from that. So it's not without NFL caliber quality at all. But a guy by the name of Ian Kennelly is a stellar safety prospect. He's a human highlight reel when it comes to and frankly, shout out to him. He did a great job of putting together his tape so that you can just Google him there on and pull him up on YouTube, and you'll find a really great cut up that he's done that demonstrates his strengths very well. Now, granted, he's not going to spend a lot of time talking about his weaknesses. That's for NFL evaluators to figure out. But at the same time, he's somebody who I would say gives himself a shot. He compared athletically very favorably to the top safeties, Malachi Starks. He actually bested Malachi Starks in a couple of areas. Imanwari, he came close to him in a couple areas and bested him in a couple of areas. So he's in that athletic conversation with those guys. And then the tape speaks for itself. So he's one that I would say, obviously, day 3, undrafted free agent, kind of a priority free agent guy would be somebody that you'd look at if you're needing a safety. He is more of a coverage type safety, more of a free safety. When you pull him up, he's athletically gifted enough that you could even, he could be a big nickel for you and do a great job as well. So he's somebody that I found and was very intrigued by. And then there's one other guy that I'll spend a little bit. So Tamuarion Wilson, if you spend any time, and I know you did because I've read your article. So if you spend any time watching David Walker at Central Arkansas, then shortly you're going to be paying attention to the players around him that just seem to be, making splash plays. And Tamuarion Wilson is that guy. He's listed as a defensive back, as a safety. But he is a thumper. So contrary to the last guy that we just talked about, really, this guy is more of a box safety, hitter. And I could see him probably transitioning even to linebacker with lighter linebackers sort of trending these days. And so he's somebody that, I'd give a shout out to. There's not a lot of footage out there on him. So your best business is really just watch David Walker and then see who's crashing things all around him. And you see Tamuarion Wilson is a guy that you should pay attention to.
Yeah, you can find I find just some games online, but it's a sort of watching television versions of the games without really knowing what you're looking for. I don't know. Sometimes, when a cat has a really great pro day and you don't know anything about them, sometimes I follow the like the 10 play rule. You put on their tape, you put on a tape of their game that they're in without knowing who they are, what number they are. And if they don't pop in the first 10 plays, you're like, all right, maybe it's not the right thing. Then you might say, well, which guy actually is it? Oh, yeah. But I feel like the guys who are really, the prospects show up almost every play. They do something that catches your eye, even if it's not a win for them. So yeah, that's definitely watching one prospect's film and noticing other prospects is like some of the key to this whole thing. I keep, putting guys on the list who are not in this class, but they'll be in future classes. Like, I'll give you a tip. Louisiana in 2024 had 3, not 1, not 2, but 3 future NFL running backs on their roster. And one of them, I think they kept 2. One was a true freshman, but one of them transferred to, I think, Alabama. He's maybe going to be the starter and somewhere in the SEC, Alabama or Mississippi, I've forgotten where. But they, it's like I'm watching for their quarterback Ben Woolridge and their wide receiver Lance Legere. who are both on the directional state team, both players that I really like. But it's just sort of like, who's this lineman and who are these running backs? And there's like a whole bunch of guys that popped on their tape. They had quite a good team. So you never know who you're going to find. Max Crosby was another one I found like that, looking at a running back and saw Max Crosby as a sophomore and thought, all right, putting him on the list.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I do have one more guy, and
Yeah.
he's not a small school guy, but he came from a smaller school prior to that. So came from Old Dominion, but worked his way to TCU. So LaMaureon James, he is prototypical nickel. He is small in stature, but packs a big punch. So he's somebody that I would say, he's worth paying a little bit of attention to if you're in the market for a nickel. I don't think he's got the size to play outside, but he's got the tenacity for sure, and he brings a lot of punch. So I would say, yeah, he's somebody who deserves a shout out. The NIL is going to be an interesting kind of impact on what you do and what we're talking about here today, because a lot of these guys that are sitting at smaller schools, if they don't have personal reasons to stick around to a place like Grand Valley State University, it's going to get to a place where, hey, somebody's going to call them up to the big leagues, and frankly, they're going to make some big money playing one of these big schools one day. But yeah, he's an example of a guy who transitioned well into that next phase. His stature is the only thing that's really keeping him from being in conversations at higher up in the round. So,
well, I feel like, wide receivers are getting smaller in the NFL in the draft. Cornerbacks are getting smaller. Like the game is changing a little bit, and maybe the resurgence of a running game, if that actually does stick in the NFL, will make that swing the other direction a little bit. But
yeah.
I do think there's a place for there's a lot of cats in the NFL who are undersized and you don't realize it until you dig into them a little bit, or if you happen to know that they're undersized because they play bigger maybe than they are.
Yep.
And so yeah, there's always room for somebody who, is carries around a stick of dynamite even if they're in a small package. I feel like that definitely works.
I'm pro Napoleon complex when it comes to draft prospects. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Except for Isaiah Bond.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
So, hey, I appreciate you being with me. Before we get to the last player, tell people where they can. You've got a new project coming up that you might be doing a new podcast series. You want to?
Yeah. Thanks for calling that out. So I'm in the developmental stages of a podcast series that I'm going to put out. That the title will be Deep Cross. And this is a little unique when it comes to this area here. It's definitely a football podcast, but it will really handle the intersection between football and faith. And there are a lot of evidences these days when you watch. I'm an interview guy, as you know. When you watch a lot of these interviews, you see a lot. It's a lot more common for prospects to be very bold and blatant about what drives them, their why. What is it that motivates them to do what they do? And so, this is going to take some time to explore that. But it is a football podcast, so there will be significant conversation in particular as we get to this draft time of year, which really does it ever stop? I'm not sure that it does.
Not anymore.
But yeah, that's a project that's forthcoming. But in the meantime, you can see on my title there, it's at Blue Ridge Bronco 1. That's Blue Ridge Bronco that you'll find me on X, and you can just watch out for a launch date there.
Super. Yeah, it sounds, I mean, you're a professional interviewer, that's actually your job. So I think you're pretty good at getting people to talk about the things that they need to talk about. So I like this idea that you're very focused on interviews. It just feels like a piece that in this whole process that not enough people do. There are, by the way, shout out to the people online who are spending a lot of time dealing with these same kinds of small schoolers and stories and whatever. Like, draft guy Jimmy from Draft Diamonds does an excellent job every year of interviewing cats. I'm sure you see a lot of those because, if there's a prospect out there that no one else has heard of, that guy has interviewed them on his show.
Yeah, you're right.
Joel Buchanan, Emery Hunt, Coach Gene Clemens. These are guys that are always, sparking the conversation with with guys from the HBCU and from smaller schools who pay attention, as you said, to some of these players. So hats off to all of them. You know, I get a lot of I learn a lot from them, and we always have a good conversation when we're doing stuff together. So anyway, appreciate that for all of you. One more prospect. He would be the my Division II Defensive Player of the Year. He's somebody who's that you are familiar with just because your daughter goes to school there. First of all, tell people, where is Carson-Newman?
Yeah, so Carson-Newman University is on the east side of Tennessee. It's in the mountains close to Pigeon Forge, and you would not know it existed if you didn't have purpose to go there. A beautiful campus, but it's a little off the beaten path.
And where do they fall on the barbecue map? Are they mustardy? Are they vinegary? Are they where are they?
If you're in Tennessee, I think it's sort of sacrilege to do anything other than sweet, kind of a sweet barbecue. I spent significant time, that's the Blue Ridge Bronco piece of it. I spent significant time in North Carolina, and I'm a big fan of the vinegary, mustardy kinds of barbecue sauces myself. But yeah, they're the sweet kind.
I'll give you a little to do. I spent some time in that area as well. And I found that actually it's less like Memphis, because Memphis is more like a sweet and smokier kind of a vibe.
Mm-hmm.
And like Carolina, it has a little bit, you get the option for like a mustardy side piece and more.
You get a fade. Fade from the.
That's right. So good barbecue there. Anyway, Major Williams.
And what a great name.
Yeah, Major Williams feels like he's built for greatness with that name, right?
Yes.
It's like in that guy named Intense Obono. It also feels, he's very directed in life, going to be successful. Major Williams is maybe, my favorite prospect from below the FCS level this year. He is a defensive back for Carson-Newman. He was a recruit to Virginia. And I think there was a little backstory that was hard to tell all the details. I think he came to Virginia with somebody that he was friends with in high school, and they both agreed to go to Virginia. And for whatever reason, it didn't work out for the other guy. And then he felt like he'd rather go someplace else because, for whatever reason, I don't know if anything was bad at Virginia, but let's put it this way. He was a quality prospect recruited to Virginia, probably I think he was a 3-star prospect, if I remember correctly. But he's a lot of times in D2, you'll see guys that are undersized or not that athletic or not that fast. Mm-hmm. But Major Williams, on the other hand, was another huge tester. And when you see him on the field, you can see why. He's plays a similar, brand of football as these sort of, all over the defensive backfield defenders like C.J. Gardner-Johnson or there's the other guy that's a little Brian Branch. Yeah. I think that's the comp that I picked for him. So he's like a guy that is going to be around the ball in the secondary, and also was a gifted returner, not only of kicks and punts, but of interceptions. So he's the guy that he'd get an interception that was hard to get to the ball, but then instead of just sort of like falling down or going out of bounds, he would then be thinking like, I'm trying to score. So I love defenders when they get the ball in their hands that they just immediately think, they switch immediately to like, I'm trying to score. So that's a certain kind of animal. That's not everybody, So good playing at the point of attack on the, as far as the catch point. Good coming downhill in the run and screen game. Played some deep middle of the field so he played all the way from, deep center field to crashing into the backfield and, making tackles for loss and sacks. So anyway, I think, in fact, he set the school record for tackles for the loss in one season with 10, which when you're a safety is pretty hard to do. That's a lot at any level of football. So at any rate, he's a guy that filled up the stat sheet, and I have a little soft spot for guys who are very physical and fill up the stat sheet as defensive backs and safeties, because it's hard to judge too much what safeties look like if you don't get a ton of all 22, because safeties are off the screen sometimes.
Right. Very often.
But if they're filling up the stat sheet and making plays, good chance that they'll continue to do that.
So what's your as far as his prospects for making the league, obviously he would be day 3 at best, but then, where do you see a fit draft wise?
I think for the teams that like to have a physical nickel, So some teams are really, really prefer to have, essentially another outside corner at nickel because they don't ask him to do too much other than cover. And that two-way go that, it's, in my opinion, is that nickel corner has become as important, if not maybe even more important than outside corner in a way. Finding a fit for that can be more difficult because it's more challenging. You have your receiver can go either way. It's not, you can't use the sideline. You might get a big slot who's like the size of a tight end who runs like a wide receiver, and if you don't have the length of the size or to compete with that strength to compete with that, it's a problem. Or you could have a jitterbug like Tez Johnson who weighs buck nothing, but literally can't, you can't cover him side to side. So you have to figure out how you're going to deal with that. So this combination of skills and coverage, some teams are just focused on that. For a team, though, that's more like, we want this guy to like blitz. We want him to be there, fill in and run support. We want him to be able to cover anything that comes at him and be more versatile, maybe even drop into, quarters or deep thirds on occasion for certain, setups. He's your guy. The versatility is going to be his calling card. Here's what I think. When you start off as a 3, 4, or 5-star recruit, your chances of getting drafted from a small school are way better than the even guys who are 0-star recruits who then moved up. So, there's a guy, Marcus Harris, that came from Idaho, was a star at Idaho, transferred up to Cal, had a very good year at Cal. I think it was made all conference honors. But, when you start off sort of lower on everybody's draft boards that they've been working on for years, it takes more work to move up than it does for a highly touted recruit to move down, no matter how poor they are. So I feel like there's always a little bias to that. But being a 3-star recruit and having the kind of success that he did, I feel like Major Williams has he would be somebody to see in the 7th round. And I think it might be more surprising if he didn't get drafted in the 7th round with his athletic profile and what performance-wise and size. The fact that he's not undersized will really work in his favor. There's a deep draft for nickel corners, I think, but I think offers a little more versatility for certain kinds of teams.
Well, and if you're watching this and these are folks you're not familiar with, when your team inevitably drafts somebody that you go, who? This article that Will's about to put out is going to be very helpful to you as a little bit of a guide. Some of these you may not know. Now, to your point, Marcus Harris, that's somebody, for those of you in Broncos country who are watching this right now, that's somebody the Broncos have actually shown interest in and have gone to work out. It kind of just adds to your point that, if you were good coming in, they'll know that you can't hide from NFL scouts if in fact you're, making a splash wherever you happen to be, even if it's an obscure town in the middle of the mountains in East Tennessee.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you a bunch for coming here and I feel it's just dumb to like sit here and stare into the camera and just talk about stuff for an hour. Like I could do that, but it's way more fun to hear your thoughts on it and have you sort of walk me through and give a couple of names that I hadn't given as much spotlight to. But I just want to let people know, if you want to see this year's article, it's on the front page at SteelerFury.com. In addition to that, our YouTube channel will have links in the bottom for the article, and the YouTube channel will have also a link to a playlist that has some highlight reels in all 22 from the players who are listed in the article, even some of those that don't have a featured video on the page. So it's a good way to sort of like kill the last week before the draft, learning about players that you don't know. And believe me, when the draft ends and you start thinking about what undrafted free agents you want your team to sign, this is exactly the kind of thing that will give you some ideas of like, oh, I like that. Or, we just, the Dolphins just signed that guy. Like, dang, I would have liked to have him. So every year I'm like, please, bring in at least one person that I really covet, because there's always about, 100 that at that stage that I'm always like, oh, this guy should have been drafted, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, that's the Directional State Team for 2025. Gabe, final thoughts about anything?
Well, I just followed up and say, hey, get your popcorn ready. That's a good watch. So, I got a little bit of the read ahead. Go visit SteelerFury.com and take a look at that article. Yeah, I can't tell you how excited I am. We're in the final week here, getting to the draft. I mean, it's a bittersweet thing. There is a little bit of an emotional challenge that you go through every time you do a mock draft. There's something in your brain that actually convinces you that those people have been drafted. So now we're getting to the real show. It's about ready to go down, and we can all return to a state of reality where we know that these people have actually found teams and homes. And it's been a pleasure discussing with you over this season. Yeah. So thank you for having me on.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for coming on. And so that's going to do it for this episode of the podcast. Don't forget that we have coming up, the next episode will be our mock draft war room, where we begin to build a board of, I think this year we built a build of 100 players that became our big board that we used during the live draft, epic mock draft of last week that Draft Professor put on. And then you'll see some, after those episodes air, then you'll see what actually happened during the draft and some behind the scenes footage and a couple of really loud expletives when certain things happened in the draft. Don't want to miss that. Gabe Morris, thanks for being with us. Blue Ridge Bronc 1 at X, Twitter, and also soon to be on Deep Cross, the podcast. Thanks, Gabe. For everybody at Steeler Fury, I'm Will Massasack, Accidental Zen, Bradshaw to Ben. Check out my article at SteelerFury.com, and I'll catch you on the next episode.